I am very, very excited and honored to be talking to Dr. Laurie Santos, a professor of psychology at Yale, head of Silliman College. I hope I said that right. And personally, to me, very excited about her podcast that she hosts, the Happiness Lab on Pushkin. This is going to be a very exciting and timely conversation. And I know folks in the company and who are joining us have been really jazzed up to dig into what is obviously a very big topic, such that the course that I know you speak is the most popular course in Yale's 300-year history. At some point, I heard that 1 in 4 students participated. Coursera picked it up. I think you have 3.3 million odd, or not followers, but participants in the online class. So clearly, you've hit a note with not just a student body demographic, but probably the broader world. Would love to just open up by hearing a little bit from you as sort of how you came to this topic. I know you've studied the human brain and mind and sociology and psychology for a long time. This class is relatively recent. Tell us a little bit your journey to sort of this topic and its resonance with, I guess, your students.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my interest in the science of well-being, I've always been interested in the mind and what we get wrong and the mistakes we make and such. But my interest specifically in the science of happiness started when I became a head of college on campus. And so it's worth kind of setting the stage a little bit. Yale's one of these weird schools like Hogwarts and Harry Potter, where it's got these like colleges within a college, kind of like Gryffindor, Slytherin sort of thing. Silliman is a dorm, but it's functionally a community where I live as a faculty member. So I'm kind of like a dorm mother to these 400 students. And I got into it thinking that college was going to be like, when I went to college back in the late 90s, where it's like, people are having fun. I didn't realize I was going to see this so-called college student mental health crisis up close and personal. So many of the students I was interacting with were reporting being depressed, being anxious, having panic attacks, even students who are suicidal, right? And I was worried, like, is this something strange about Yale? But it turns out this is just nationwide, the sort of mental health crisis we're seeing. Like, just to get a sense of how bad it is for folks out there who have, either high school age or college age kids. Right now, nationally, 40% of college students report being so depressed it's difficult to function most days. More than 60% say that they're overwhelmingly anxious. And more than 12% have seriously considered suicide in the last year. So if you look at 1 in 10 like college students, one of them is seriously considering suicide. And so that is scary and awful. And when I saw these statistics, I was kind of like, we have to do something about this, right? My students aren't learning computer science or economics or anything I think we're teaching them if so many students are struggling that much. And so that's kind of how the class was born. I said, well, what can I do to help? I'm a psychologist. I'm a professor, we teach classes, right? So I'm like, oh, let me help that way. The idea is like, if we could teach students strategies that we know from science really work to make you feel better, and I like taught students the science behind it and gave them these strategies, hopefully it would make a difference. But I didn't think the class was going to go, as viral as it did. It was like a new class on campus. So I figured like 40 students would walk in. Right. You could imagine my surprise when we walked into like a concert hall filled with a quarter of the entire Yale campus. And so, but I think that tells us something important, right? These students are voting with their feet, right? Like the teens don't like those statistics I was just telling you about. They know there's a problem and they're really looking for solutions. And that's why I love the scientific work, right? Like if evidence-based strategies, scientifically they're going to work. You just need to figure out how to put them into effect in your own life. And so, and then everything else kind of came with that. We thought like, oh, this would be a great thing to have a podcast on where we could kind of tell different narrative stories about this stuff. Everyone loves this class. Let's put it online for free. 3 million people signed up on Coursera. So it's not just college students. I think that's a particular population that needs this stuff. But, we all kind of worry that we're not flourishing a lot. Many of us feel like we're putting work into our happiness, but something's not right. And I think the thing that's not right is we have not great intuitions about the kinds of things that are going to work for happiness. So we need some help from the science.
Well, I want to get into sort of the substance of the class and some of these, methods that you talk about. But I'm curious on a personal level, why now? I mean, it feels like the world in many respects is totally mad from a political, a social, an economic perspective. It feels like there's more madness in the world than there's been in a long time. But in the opposite, as a globe, as a society, we are more materially affluent. And I use the word materially affluent in general terms. And obviously, many have done far better than others. But as an overall world, we're far better off than we were. Why now? Why are we reaching this, point of such terrifying statistics now? And I'm going to venture to say that you're seeing sort of the demographic that you see, but this is probably more applicable to all demographics.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking. I mean, it's worth saying that when I first taught the class, it was 2018. So this was sort of pre-COVID, I mean, I think there was a lot still of anti-Black violence and these kinds of things, but it was a different time than the kind of conversations we're having now about Black Lives Matter and things like that. So it was almost prescient to be thinking about it, pre-COVID, kind of pre some of this really awful stuff. But that said, one thing we know, especially at the college level, these mental health statistics are bad, but they're also recently bad. Like that depression statistic I gave you, the level of depression that we see in young people has doubled in just the last 9 years, right? And you ask the question like, okay, what is happening, right? And I think, it gets to the point you made about material affluence, right? We have been focusing on that stuff. For our young people, we've been focusing on their accolades, their grades, what job they're going to get and so on. And of course, there's a point at which that matters, right? Material affluence really matters if you're living in traumatic situation, if you can't put a roof over your head, no pun intended for the standard folks, but you can't put food on your table.
That is a very traumatic event for us.
It's really particularly traumatic for a standard. But the point is like, you need a certain base level of finances to function in modern society. But a lot of us are well past that. And still we feel like we're not flourishing enough, right? And I think sometimes what happens is when we feel like we're missing something, we double down on the material affluence, right? Like, well, I need a raise, or I should get a new car, I should buy something new. And we're kind of chasing after stuff that's really, not working. One of my favorite podcast episodes was on one where I interviewed this guy, Clay Cockrell, who's a wealth psychologist. So he's a mental health professional and all his clients are in the 0.0001%. And already that's telling because he has clients, right? Some of us would have thought like, if I was doing that well, I probably, wouldn't need to go to someone. But they too think they don't have enough money. They're sad because they're only in the 100 million category. If only I could be a billionaire. Money brings its own problems. Like Clay talked about one client who was really stressed out because his marriage was falling apart because they couldn't figure out where to park their yacht, like literally park their yacht. And so, I think we think material affluence is going to solve it all. And I think we're critically missing something. And I think that's where the evidence-based science can come in. Science will tell you, yeah, below the poverty line, you need more finances to feel good. But once you get there, you need something else. And so I think that's why the science is so critical.
So let's dig in a little bit to some of the specifics that you talk about in class in the podcast. I guess we're all cheating here a little bit, getting an abridged version. But you talk about our mind and ourselves not being so good at predicting what will actually make us happy versus what we think will make us happy, and whether it's the glitches of the brain and effectively, rewiring our brain to reorient ourselves towards things that maybe actually will move the needle on happiness. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a critical place to start, right? Because we often think we have good intuitions about stuff, right? Like if I ask you, what would it take to make you happy? Probably everyone listening to this could come up with some stuff. And those intuitions are the guidelines we're using to design our behavior. That's how we pick how we spend our time, what we spend our money on, and so on. And if our intuitions are wrong, that means that it's not that we're not putting work into our happiness. We're putting work in, we're just doing it wrong. And the sad thing is that that's really what the research shows. The research shows that our intuition is that often to be happier, we think we need to change our circumstances, right? Change our job, change our friend group, like change something about our lives. But the science shows that, again, unless you're in dire circumstances, and it's worth recognizing the privilege of probably most of the people on this call, like there are a lot of people who are in those dire circumstances who we should care about and take action on. But many of the people listening right now probably aren't, right? And so changing your circumstances just isn't going to work in the way that we think. The key is that we have to change some of our behaviors. And they're often not behaviors that we think really matter. But then when we really engage with them, we can move the needle a lot more than we think.
Can we talk about some of those behaviors? I mean, I saw something that really resonated with me was the concept of the hedonic adaptation and just getting used to things, either good or bad. and, maybe a focus on experiences as opposed to material things, and, variety being the spice of life. Interested in sort of what you've come across as you've, sort of talked to folks young and less young on some of these tricks.
Yeah, well, one of the tricks really involves like knowing the spots where our minds lead us astray. And that's where I think hedonic adaptation comes in. So hedonic adaptation is just a fancy psychologist way of saying that we
I thought it sounded good.
Yeah, it sounds good, right? But it's just like we get used to stuff. That's what it means, right? So if you get a new salary, at first that feels great. Oh my gosh, I'm making so much money. But then, 3 months later, that's just the amount of money you make. You buy a new iPhone, right? You get the new fancy dancy, I don't even know what we're up to, 12, a million, whatever. You get the iPhone 50. And for a week, oh my gosh, all these new apps, so much faster. Da, da, da. A month later, you're just kind of bored with it. This is a metaphor for everything that happens in our lives, our marriages, the good things that happen, even COVID, right? Even bad things, right? At first, it's like, I don't think I can take this if it's a bad thing. Or at first, it's like, this is wonderful when you first get it. But then we kind of just get used to stuff. And that sort of tells us a little bit why material affluence isn't doing what it's doing, right? The more money you get, the more you kind of just get used to stuff, right? The more material possessions you buy, the material affluence that you put into your life, you get used to it. And that's one of the reasons that if you want to spend your money on stuff that will help, you need to spend your money on stuff that doesn't allow you to get used to it. And that gets into this idea of experiences versus things. You might have heard like, spend on experiences. Why? Well, most experiences that people are spending on don't last that long, right? If I'm going to go on vacation, it's not going to last as long as an iPhone 12, right? Like unless you get a different salary, really good vacation, right? But concerts, like vacations, like, dinner with your spouse, right? Like these things are short, but from the perspective of hedonic adaptation, that's great, right? You just don't have time to get used to it. Another thing we don't get used to is the kind of warm glow we get from helping others. So another way to stay happy is to buy stuff for other people, spend your money on others. That warm glow kind of comes back to you in these interesting ways. You could sort of don't have hedonic adaptation for doing for others. So again, one of the reasons money doesn't make us as happy as we think is we spend it wrong. We buy these things that we get used to. But if you spend your money on experiences, if you spend it, doing for others, that can actually boost your well-being through your material affluence.
What are some of the tricks that you've, practiced in your own life to be more present, to, to focus on, whether it's called otherness or being, the practice of gratitude?
Yeah, well, I actually have employed a lot of these during COVID, right? Because I think, as we're going to probably talk about, COVID was a really tough time, right? We did kind of marshal all the strategies we can to feel better. And I remember being particularly frustrated and annoyed and sad on my like peak COVID birthday. Now everybody's had a whole year of COVID birthdays. So it feels, but I was like, it's my birthday. I can't go out with my friends. I can't do this. Like, wow. But then I'm like, okay, let me, use these strategies. And I thought, well, this might be a time to give presents to other people. Right? Like that's what the data suggests. I'm going to spend money. Maybe me getting presents isn't going to work as well as present for somebody else. And so I have these other faculty who are heads of college and other colleges, and my birthday's in August. And this was in August of 2020, a time when we were really scared, right? We're going back into this semester. We don't know what COVID's going to be like on campus. And so I wrote each of them a really heartfelt like letter of saying like, I'm so happy that, if I'm going to have to go through this, I'm going through this with you. Thank you for being there. And I gave them like a bottle of champagne. And it sounds so cheesy, but like their reactions to that were better than any reaction to the present I could have gotten myself if I spent that much money on, or if they gave me the presents. Like, and it's salient to talk about today because now we're in the summer again. And one of my colleagues literally yesterday just texted me and he was like, I just found that letter you wrote me last summer. It meant so much. And it's like a year later, I'm still getting the happiness like boost from having done this, right? Like whatever I got for my birthday, it wouldn't have been as good. And so that's just one example. But the idea is like these, I guess it shows a couple things. One is like, I don't have the right intuitions. Like I know all the science of this stuff, but I was still like buying them the champagne, like this still sucks. Like my birthday, I'm giving other people presents. But like, in fact, in practice, when you engage in it, even if it violates your intuition, you'll get this kind of happiness boost. So, that's just one, but it has all these features: doing for others, spending your money on, in some ways, experiences. Champagne's kind of, this drink, gratitude, kind of taking time in the midst of this time when it was so yucky and we were so scared to think about what I appreciated. Connecting with other people is another big one. One of the main findings in positive psychology shows that happy people are the most social. One study shows the social connection is a necessary condition for high happiness. You can't be highly happy in the highest echelons of happiness if you don't feel socially connected. And this is a way to connect with other people.
And you talk about that being true for both extroverts and introverts, and in particular, a focus on sort of those casual, smaller social moments that happen in our world. I loved the podcast that you did with the inventor of the ATM, and I guess it's his wife who refuses to use ATMs because they're tellers who do that. But tell us, sort of expand a little bit on the social benefits vis-a-vis happiness and the smaller moments in life.
Yeah, I think this is another spot that we get it wrong. If I ask, everybody kind of knows that, being lonely isn't awesome for happiness, and feeling socially connected is probably good. But I think when we think of social connection, we think of a certain form of it, like peak social connection. For me, it's like me hanging out with my college roommates who are my best friends, live in person, right? Like we have this theory of it. But actually, when you look at the science, it's actually a lot of the weak ties that, particularly for positive moods, seem to matter a lot, right? That quick chat with the barista at the coffee shop, or, running into someone at work at the water cooler who you haven't talked to in a while, or just like the smile that you engage when you're walking down the street and two people lock eyes on a cute puppy and you notice the other person noticing the cute puppy or something, right? Like these aren't my, best friends who know me forever. These are just these subtle social interactions. And the science shows that those matter a lot for happiness. I actually think that that's one of the biggest hits that we've experienced over COVID, is that a lot of those weak ties, we just don't get in the same way anymore. And one of my favorite experiments that looked at this sort of forced people to engage in those sort of stranger connections. This is a study by the psychologist Nick Epley. And he kind of forces people to talk to other commuters on the train, again, pre-COVID, when we were all on trains, no masks, chatting together, right? And people hate this. People predict that this is going to be an awful intervention that's going to make everybody feel awkward and people are going to be annoyed. But what really happens is the people who are assigned to talk to someone else on the train feel a lot better. And those who are assigned to enjoy their solitude, because he has this control condition where he tells people, just enjoy your solitude, they feel worse afterwards. And this is a spot where we know it's not just, extroverts. He actually measures introversion and finds that introverts have a stronger prediction that the interaction is going to suck, but they get just as much of a happiness boost from it. So,
amazing.
And it's our predictions are leading us astray a little bit.
Don't always know what we want. Tying back to sort of one of the questions I asked up front about why now, on the Happiness Lab, I was particularly attracted to the Ancients, series that you did, whether it was Plato and Aristotle and Taoism and things of that sort. So it feels like much of the theology or spirituality or thought process, or maybe even the word science around happiness, has been around for a while. So when you sort of marry that fact with the why now thing, can you, kind of trace any reason why these, I guess, accepted kind of methods for dealing with the glitches in our brain haven't been taken up in a more sustainable way by our society on a global basis? I mean, it feels like when you sort of go through these practices, and I think the fact that practice is required is an important fact to point out. But there's a lot of commonality and clearly a lot of history for these practices. Why are we still so late to the party of identifying how to help our happiness?
Yeah, well, it's nice when you look at the way the ancients spent a lot of their time. In my episodes on Plato and Aristotle, my colleague Tamar Gendler, who's helping with these, reminded us these were dudes who didn't have any other capitalist restrictions on their times, right? All they had to do was sit down and think about how this stuff worked,
right.
And so in some ways, it's not such a surprise that they came up with some, good ways to do this. But, I think we've moved away from a lot of their influences, right? These were folks who were focused on character, doing the hard thing at cost. Many of the ancient folks we interview are religious, right? So they go along with practices that in some ways we've kind of dropped out a little bit on, in a kind of secular world. And so I think it's so important to go back to some of these ancient traditions where these folks, in many cases, got them right. And not in all cases, right? We can point to each of these ancients and be like, on that social justice point, let's not do that. Yeah. But, for many of the wisdom traditions, they're getting certain things right about happiness. And that's why I love the marriage of the science and the ancients, because the science can let us figure out, okay, where are the spots where they're right? And there are many domains now where the science is really following what the ancient practice talked about, right? So much great science on this idea of mindfulness and presence, meditation, and things like that. Those are straight out of spiritual traditions, generally Buddhist traditions, but even beyond, right? And so now we're getting good scientific basis on why some of these things work and also the mechanisms by which they work. But yeah, they're not new. Often they were things that people were prescribing that were hard too. If I tell you, hey, you got to meditate half hour every day, it's like, like, okay, sounds good, but it's like a little bit hard. So
I started meditating, I guess now, not 10 years, but definitely more than 5 years ago. And, I'm pretty good at it, but I'm not as good as I'd like to be at it. And I don't mean in terms of like actual skill at it. I mean, in terms of frequency and uptake of it. And it takes, effort. It's not, I get up pretty early to begin with. It's not so easy to get up 20 minutes earlier and do that when you can either, lie in bed for another 20 minutes or grab like a 19th cup of coffee. So practice, I think, is really important here. How much of this kind of why now vis-a-vis the ancients has to do with just the pace, the competitiveness, the technology, the always on nature of our world, both in our personal lives and our professional lives? I mean, how much of this is a binary decision to participate in society versus, an opportunity to slow down? You talk about sort of just the massive amount of information that's thrown at all of us all the time. I mean, how do we kind of navigate this? How do we find a better balance between the things that you talk about that will make us actually happier, but not, running away from our lives and society?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this why now question gets back to some of the statistics I was talking to you about before, right? The one, right? The rates of depression have doubled in the last 9 years, right? Like, what happened? What's different now, right? And I think the thing that's different is the kind of technology we interact with. These weren't around in the same kind of demanding way like that long ago. And I think that they come with all kinds of changes, right? They come with the fact that even though devices like this are supposed to universally enhance our social connection, we've all seen cases where people are sitting at dinner with their family and they're all looking at their individual screens, right? One of the most shocking changes to undergraduate life that I experienced when I became a head of college was in the dining hall. I remember dining halls, like when I was in college, it was like the loudest place on campus and everybody's there and talking. Now it's still loud, but you get a lot of students with the big headphones on their screen, right? Like the most social space that you can imagine in the dining hall at college, and they're, looking at a screen. And so, so many of us are changing the way we normally interact because of technology, right? And technology is just a tool. It's not like this stuff is inherently bad. It's just some of the habits we've developed around it may or may not be the best that we need for our own well-being in terms of social connection, in terms of sleep. You mentioned the extra, want to lay in bed for 20 minutes, maybe you go back to sleep and you're more like, have a healthier habit than I do. But often when I'm in bed in the 20 minutes, like I'm doing that, the first interaction I have in the morning is with my email. It's not even to like lean over and give my husband who's in bed a kiss. It's like, oh, that meeting's coming up, and cortisol shoots. And so I think, we have changed our relationship to work. We've changed our relationship to news and the world and the negative stuff in the world, in part because of these devices. And so this is a wonderful moment that, and a lot of people have been talking about this, about, using this COVID moment to redefine our relationship with technology. A lot of people had this vis-a-vis the news, right? Not just with COVID, but, with all this stuff going on, you want to be an informed citizen, to deal with the stuff we need to deal with in the world. But you can pick and choose when that information is coming in. Just because the news cycle is 24/7 doesn't mean that you have to be on it 24/7. And so things like tech Sabbaths, just, putting your phone away for certain hours of the day, no phone meals at tables. Powerful techniques to kind of, again, not say technology is bad, but just to kind of take it in different doses.
Absolutely. I mean, so before we get to the COVID topic, I'm curious, you living and working with, folks in their early 20s, are you actually able to get them to put the technology away? I mean, what tricks or bribes or other, voodoo do you do?
Yale doesn't give us enough money to bribe them. So one of my favorite techniques for this is again, it's not getting rid of the technology. It's just kind of being more mindful when you interact
Right.
with it. And one of my podcast guests, this woman, Catherine Price, has this book called How to Break Up with Your Phone. And she argues in the book, you don't have to break up with your phone, but you have to like take it to couples counseling. And the way that she suggests couples counseling is to use a quick acronym to kind of figure out like why and how you're interacting with technology. So it's WWW. It's not the greatest acronym, but it's what for, why now, and what else. So every time you sort of notice that you're on your phone, ask those questions. So what for? Was I picking it up to check the weather? Was I going to check my email? Like, did I have a purpose? This question of why now, right? Did you like, was there the purpose that of like, maybe I was anxious, or maybe I was bored. I was just in line, and rather than talk, oh, that's what I do when I'm in line is I pick up my phone, right? And then the biggest question is the what else, right? Like, what's the opportunity cost? If I'm in line, I could be talking to the person next to me. If I'm outside, I could be noticing the trees. And I've used this technique, and it's kind of helped my students because, again, it doesn't say you have to put the phone down, but it's this moment to recognize what the opportunity cost is. And I've had students say things to me like, when I started doing this, I realized I didn't want to miss out on interactions in the courtyard. We have this beautiful courtyard that students are kind of constantly crossing through. And they'd say, when I have my phone out in the courtyard, I'm just not noticing people or talking to them. So like, I just made a rule of like, just not in the courtyard, keep it in your pocket, right? And It sounds silly, but simple things like that can allow you to make sure you're using your technology your way. So it's kind of, you're controlling it rather than it controlling you.
It's mindfulness. It's being mindful about the way you eat, the way you sleep, the way you, I guess, go on Instagram or Snapchat or anything in between. So just feels like a heavy task for a lot of young people today.
But sometimes these quick tips really help. Another one we talk about in the class is, again, a big thing for teens is using, and for adults too, is phones and sleep, right? Like and I think one of the worst things cell phone companies ever did for our sleep is to put an alarm clock as a major feature in a phone. If we just had like the camera and the email, it wouldn't be as bad as the alarm clock. And so with my students, I'm like, you can get a $4 alarm clock, at the student store. And some of the students who did that were like, it's just my first, like, I actually have to get up to get it, right? Like my first interaction doesn't have to be with it. And just like that simple separation. Parents out there, I think, get your kids a real alarm clock. Don't let them use, even if they have phones, don't let them use phones. Huge. It's just, again, it's these subtle changes can actually lead to big differences in how you interact. And they can snowball because you realize like, oh, I didn't like that feeling. Maybe I should do that a little bit more before bed too. And again, this sort of just non-judgmental noticing of what the interaction's like.
So hopefully coming out of COVID here, but not exactly on the other side just yet. We've all been through a year and a half like no other. Very, very difficult for many. And one that probably exposed a lot of realities about our individual and kind of communal lives. I'm curious sort of what your big takeaways were, but most importantly, were there any major surprises to you, or did this sort of just reveal what you sort of knew to be true about kind of our culture today based on what you were seeing at Yale? Or were there any major surprises? And are you hopeful that this is a moment where people really are going to sort of reprioritize their agendas and do things differently going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were lots of surprises. One was, without question, this was awful, right? People lost loved ones, people lost jobs. Like, it was an awful, awful time. But the data that are coming out now suggests that, again, it's yet another case where we're more resilient than we thought, right? If you look at the mental health data across, from like March 2020, peak COVID and stuff, people had a huge hit in terms of depression and anxiety in April. But for many people, that curve kind of went back up. This is, again, what we were just talking about, hedonic adaptation. When you're first in lockdown, you can't see your friends, you got to wear a mask to the grocery store. This is like, it feels like emotional game over. But then you kind of just get used to it, right? You figure out Zoom happy hours, it's a thing. Like, the kids get into more of a routine. Again, were we fully back to baseline? No, but much more resilient than I think everyone thought. This was a real surprise. All these, positive psychology researchers started studying this, doing these surveys, thinking, oh my gosh, what are we going to see afterwards? And it was a hit, but it wasn't as bad as a hit as we thought. And I think that's a surprise, right? We can go through a global pandemic and still see like the fact that we bounce back, still see the fact that this so-called psychological immune system is sort of doing its work. That's incredibly powerful. And I think the second change is something, that we sort of mentioned before, which is I think people are using this to like really rethink what's going on. This kind of comes straight out of some scientific work on what's called the fresh start effect. Our lives are this kind of continuous stream, but we don't think about them as a continuous stream. We break them up. It's like when I lived at that place, or, before I worked at Standard, right? Or my birthday, like I turned 30 and now it's like post 30, right? And those moments have real psychological weight. In general, we're really bad at forming new habits, but at these natural temporal breaks, right? Like you move to a new place, you have one of these major birthdays, it's just easier to start a new habit. Like that's when you start running, the day you turn 30, and we can stick with it in a different way. The idea is we can use COVID like this. What a natural temporal break, right? We are all gonna, when we're old and gray, we're gonna remember March 2020, right? Sure. Like no other March, right?
Sure. That's for sure.
And I think for some of us, like when we go back to work, when our kids go back to school, like these will be natural changes. And the key is like, it's rare that our mind has this temporal moment. Like the key is we need to be really intentional and use it, right? And make sure we don't waste it. Hopefully this is all of our only like global pandemic rodeo. We're not going back to like a new crazy virus, right? Like it means we need to kind of use it well. And I think many people are, people are rethinking their work life, they're rethinking their family habits, they're rethinking the amount of time they want to spend with their families, where they want to live, right? How they want to spend their money, what they want to invest in, right? These are big changes that people are making. And I think, COVID coming to terms with, death in some cases, like, these major changes have really forced us to think carefully about this stuff. So I've been surprised at how much of a fresh start this has been, and how it's really like feels like a cultural shift where we're all rethinking stuff well.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And bringing this home a little bit to Standard, because there's a lot of folks from Standard who are participating right now. A lot of this conversation and your work, I feel like, or maybe I'm wrong, but is on an individual level and speaking to individuals. And, we spend a lot of time, David Millstone, my partner, and I on, thinking kind of hopefully about how we can attract and excite and importantly retain in a sustainable way, just unbelievable talent across the organization, across the world. And, curious how some of these concepts and practices that we all talk about on an individual level can be, aggregated, if that's the right way to think about it, and implemented on a more, corporate or institutional level, so that we're talking about happiness in the workplace, and we're talking about a better work-life balance that makes something sustainable, because we talk about pace and, just the competitive nature of the world. Are there tricks, or maybe they're the same tricks, or things that we can focus on at Standard from a cultural perspective that helps us protect the things that we all know will lead to better outcomes from a happiness perspective, but not sacrifice, frankly, our ambitions in the business, and not sacrifice, the way we go about trying to achieve, big things.
Yeah, I think, the first realization that comes directly from the science is that the great news for businesses is that you don't have to choose. We often think like, well, if I focus on work-life balance, productivity, which one are we going to pick? All the data are strikingly consistent. When your employees are happy, when your teams are happy, they will just be more creative and productive. They'll be healthier first, right? Like you'll just like lose less sick time, all these things, but they'll actually be more productive. There are really tight correlations with people's positive mood and things like creative problem solving, kind of elegant problem solving. There's lots of evidence that there's emotional contagion. So if you get one person who's happy on a team, that will contagiously transfer to other people. So if you double down on good policies, you get these sort of cumulative returns in terms of people's well-being. And so I think the key there is that you don't have to pick, right? And I think that's really critical for companies to realize. The second thing is that, all these evidence-based strategies we've just been talking about, they're exactly the kinds of things you can bring into an organization, right? What's an organization's, policy procedures on like technology, right? Sure. Do people have real breaks? Do you encourage people to ask what it's for? Maybe we just don't need email at this time or something like that. Again, different companies are going to have different ways to explore it. Sure. But even recognizing that, material benefits, great, like good pay for work is great, but these other kinds of payments are powerful too. Things like allowing people to express gratitude, allowing people to be a little bit more present, giving people space for other, things we haven't talked about yet, things like exercise and stuff like that. All of these can be really, really powerful. And when you build them in, you get productivity, good decision-making, creativity for free. And
Sure.
that I think is really the key. So I think these are things to really focus on and build in, and to encourage employees to kind of come up with their own ideas for how to do it. Right. And so, yeah.
Well, we're working hard on it and definitely focused on it. But again, it takes practice, and it takes effort, because everybody's got a lot that they're balancing in their lives, and maybe more now than ever before. And carving out time, even if it's time to be idle, seems more challenging than it's ever been before. Which I want to be sensitive to time, because there's a lot of folks who've put questions out here for you, and I want to get to their questions. But the last one, which is, I don't want to call it selfish, but it's definitely a big one for me. Talk about time affluence, because one of the biggest challenges I find personally in my own life is just, managing time and the evaporation of time. I know time affluence is a big topic for you. Can you just share what that means?
Yeah. So time affluence is the subjective sense that you have some free time, right? It's not the objective amount of free time you have. It's just your sense that, I could just take some time off or be idle or whatever. It's the opposite of what we normally experience, which is time famine, where we're literally famished for time. Especially during COVID, especially if you have young kids, right? I think that these are the kinds of things that many of us go through, but we're only now starting to recognize how awful time famine is for our well-being, right? There's one study suggesting that if you self-report being time famished a lot, that's as big of a hit on your well-being as if you self-report being unemployed. We have like whole government programs to fix unemployment for lots of reasons, but one is well-being. We might need similar government programs to focus on time famine, which is really tricky. And so the good news is that the science gives us a couple of good strategies to deal with improving our time affluence. One just comes from the fact that our brains don't respond to the objective amount of time we have. They respond to the subjective sense that we have some time. And that means we can kind of trick our brains a little bit, right? Like it doesn't take much in objective time to feel like, oh yeah, I got, some free time. If you forget that, remember the last time that like a meeting that you really thought was in your calendar got canceled. You either show up to the conference room or the Zoom meeting. You're like, where's everybody? Like, oh yeah, I'm so sorry. We forgot to put it in your Outlook or whatever. We just like canceled that. And you're like, I have a half hour.
Vacation.
Yeah, it's like I could learn, a new language or go skiing. It's only a half hour,
Right.
We did this with my students where, I was going to have a whole class teaching them all the science of time affluence. And, time famine is something that these college students report. 87% of them say that they feel completely overwhelmed in terms of time most days, right? In college right now. I mean, we can all relate. And so I thought like, well, this is ironic that I'm going to take up like an hour and a half of their time to tell them all the science about this stuff.
Right.
And so I canceled class. But again, I canceled class in this way that they just showed up to class and they got a little flyer from my teaching assistant that says, to teach you about time affluence, I'm going to give you some, right? And the key was like, you can't do work. You have to do something that's like, reflects the fact that you have some free time. And students like went to the recording studio, they took a walk, they ran into other students, they got bubble tea and like hung out on the quad. Like they all just reported like such, not even like positive mood, because obviously, positive mood, but like a breather, right? Like the rest of midterm season was easier, right? Because of like an hour. And so that's one thing to recognize is like, we can give that to ourselves. And oftentimes we are giving it to ourselves and we just don't realize it. So I imagine a lot of the people listening, maybe during COVID or whatever, you've gotten like curbside pickup or like gone out to a restaurant or something. We don't often frame that in terms of giving ourselves time, but it is, right? If you get a burger and fries, that's, meat you didn't have to go to the grocery store to get, or potatoes you didn't have to fry and chop up, and often dishes you didn't have to watch. You could put a timestamp on it. You could be like, that was an hour and 14 minutes that I just saved, right? As soon as you do that, you're like, oh my gosh, what did I do with that extra hour and 14 minutes? It feels amazing. So spending your money to get time back, framing it that way. And my favorite tip, one that I have to use a lot, is to make good use of the time we do have. One of the strangest research findings in this field of time affluence is that if you look at people's time budgets, not necessarily during COVID, but kind of pre-COVID, we actually have more free time now than we did 5 years ago and 10 years ago. We don't think it because it's broken up in different ways. So if you look at people's time budgets, we have more free time, but it's, 5 minutes before that Zoom meeting or 10 minutes when your kid falls asleep. It's what these scientists call time confetti, these like little pieces here. Right. And it's time confetti because we often just throw it up. We're like, I'll just check email, or I'll just like, screw around on social media or something. The key though is that that's our free time. So if you maximize your time confetti, if you use it in ways that boost your well-being or give you more sense of time affluence, it can be really powerful. So researcher Ashley Willens, who's awesome, she has this book called Time Smart. She recommends making a time confetti like to-do list. So that when you get the extra 5 minutes, something's canceled, you're like, what's on my, you don't just like gravitate towards email or Twitter or check,
Right.
you like, look, you're like, meditate for 5 minutes, 5 deep breaths, text that friend to set up a time to like hang out, like take a moment to look around you and notice what you're grateful for. Just breathe, right? Those things can be, for me, that's been a real game changer. And it's having the list, so it's like, I'm about to check my email.
Ready to go.
I'll go on my phone and look at the list. Oh, this is what I want to do with my time.
It's a lot of pressure. So I want to get to folks' questions because I don't want to go on too long. Get them in front of me because they were submitted. All right. So the first question that came in was, we spend so much time online and on social media. What role or effect does online versus offline activity have on people's happiness? Is there an ideal balance to strike? I know we talked about this a little bit, but it's a huge topic, I think, for somebody in a workplace, but parents and children alike. I mean, is there specific rules or parameters that you would advise people to put around that balance? And I guess just to weave one other thought in is how does that play into your thoughts on being back in the workplace and work from home and that trade-off?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing we need to realize is that we get something special about many of our live interactions, right? Whether that's live interactions connecting with other humans in real time, in real life, live interactions of like walking around, think of doing like a museum tour on a screen versus walking around the real museum, right? But we also get a lot of benefits from the screen version, right? And so how can you maximize the benefits that you're getting from the screen version? With social interaction, we actually know a lot about what's good about that and what's bad, right? And so what's best about the screen-based social interaction is if you're doing it in real time, ideally with some image, like you and I are talking on the Zoom interface. Zoom's pretty good. So we can react to each other's expressions. We see each other, that's pretty good. What's not good is the asynchronous, like I text you 5 minutes later, you write back, right? Like that just doesn't work as well. And so I think the more, even if we're working from home, we could build in the kind of synchronous, see each other kind of interactions, all the better. A second thing that we know from these kinds of interactions is like, they're kind of a little bit more exhausting, right? Like we're having a great conversation in real time. This is good. But after, I'll be a teensy bit more depleted, like doing it this way than if we were in the same room together.
100%.
Why? There is a delay and our brain is tagging it, and the audio delay, our brain is tagging it and it kind of just like exhausts us a little. Another thing that we often do is like, we want to see ourselves and make sure there's nothing goofy in our background. So I'm looking at myself at the same time, which, my brain isn't really used to seeing me too, right? And so that can be a little exhausting. And so I think the thing to remember with that is that you want to give yourself breaks, right? If you have a bunch of these real screen interactions, as much as possible with COVID regulations, have a real in real life interaction, right? Talk to a family member, go out and just walk and see the trees or whatever, right? Like get back to real presence. And one of the forms of that is to move around too. Another problem with screens is that we usually, like you and I are doing, we're just sitting here. Sometimes if it's possible, even with work stuff, if you can do it where you're moving around, right? Like I can have this conversation while I'm chopping veggies for, work. And then I'm at least standing, moving, like building in physical movement, either during or definitely after these things is really powerful. So those are ways to do it well.
There was a good Times article in deep COVID about Zoom fatigue and exactly what you're talking about, the why thing. And it felt like, there were more meetings being scheduled just, for the sake of scheduling a meeting than existed in the real world pre-COVID. And one of the things that I caught early in that article, which then transformed the way that I sort of did these Zooms from there on, was this like a need to stare in one another's eyes for 45 minutes. When you're in a normal meeting or a normal social setting, you can look around, you can be a little bit more relaxed, you can move, to use your words, and without feeling that pressure of, just that one-on-one intensity. It's a lot. It's exhausting.
No, totally. I did this. I've been doing, my brother and my mom are in different cities and we do these Friday get-togethers over Zoom. It was the same. It was like, I'm sitting on the couch, we're all sitting. Exactly. I was like, no, this is stupid. Like, I'm just going to walk with the laptop and I'm going to, do what I would normally do a few years over the house, which is I'd
Totally.
prep dinner or I'd walk around or, you know, those can be really powerful.
Good. I guess the next one's a short one, but a big one. What has surprised you the most in your study of human happiness?
I have so many surprises. So this is hard. I mean, I think, you know, I guess the biggest surprise is like just how many parts we're bad at when it comes to this, just like how bad our intuitions are, right? Like I've been studying this in detail. I have a whole podcast on it. Most of my life is spent like deep in the trenches on the science on this stuff. But when it comes to making my own decision, I'm still really bad at it, right? We have this whole podcast that's coming out next season on how I'm bad at getting up for exercise and what can I do to get up for exercise. And literally this morning when the alarm went off, I was like, oh God, I'm not gonna exercise. And I was like, wait, I have a whole, like I'm talking to thousands of people about this. Like, I'm supposed to know how to do it. But that's the thing, right? Like our brains weren't designed to make us happy. They were designed to like be good at hunting and gathering and reproducing and, you know, noticing the scary stuff so we could live and stay alive, right? It takes a lot of practice and a lot of work to build these things in. They're going to constantly feel counterintuitive, but if you just kind of listen to them and do them, then you get better at them in the sense of habit. You kind of get good at forcing yourself and then also noticing like some of the benefits. You know, I told this story about, you know, giving my presents away on my birthday. Like I'm still noticing, you know, my birthday is coming up again. I'm like, all right, I don't have the intuition that that's going to be good, but I've told the story a million times. It's probably going to be good. You know, so I think that's the biggest surprise is like, you can know this stuff so well and be so practiced at it.
Right.
It still doesn't come naturally, but you know, like, you know, if you talk to the Dalai Lama, he'll say the same thing about meditation, right? Like dude meditates for many hours a day and he still has a hard time with it. So it's, you know, our brains aren't built for some of this stuff that makes us feel good, but
it's slightly reassuring to hear about the Dalai Lama. I guess this one gets, you know, closer to the ancients, but how has our conception of happiness changed throughout history? Does the definition of happiness also depend on what a culture values, or is there something more timeless about what makes us happy?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two ways I could answer that question. There's like what we think makes us happy, and the question of like what really, like as humans, Homo sapiens, makes us happy. And honestly, my read is that we can define things differently, but ultimately the main things that matter for our happiness are pretty universal, right? You could go anytime in human history, anywhere in the world, social connection is still going to feel good. Presence is still going to feel good. Doing nice things for others is still going to feel good, right? Like these things don't change over time. They're just like universal features of human nature. How we think about happiness, I think, has changed a lot. Right. And in practice right now in the modern kind of capitalist day, I think we really think it has to do a lot with material affluence or kind of our own accolades, right? We define it in really selfish terms. But if you look back historically, even in a lot of religious traditions, it's defined as being a good person, you know, having a good character, having the right values and things. And so, you know, I think we define it in different ways. And I think those ways of defining it really shape our intuitions. But ultimately for what actually will work, you know, those things are going to be the same no matter where you go.
I wonder how much of this is sort of how the definition has or hasn't changed as much as how much the importance of happiness has or hasn't changed, or the importance of happiness in a given culture is more or less valued. Do you find that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what's funny in the modern day, and, you know, in some ways this is good for happiness business, right, is like people really, really want to be happy now. Really, they're focused on being happy. They're not as much focused on, I'm going to build my character and whatever. Like they're focused on getting happy. The irony is that the way they would get the most happy is probably to do these other things that you could have focused on about the moral. So yeah, I do think that, you know, our obsession with happiness has changed a lot. I mean, it's increased a lot, even in just the last 20 years or so. And in some ways that might be to our detriment. But, you know, once you figure out like, oh, the way to actually do it is, you know, not necessarily to go for the money and the accolades, it's to do this other stuff.
No, it does feel like there's a bigger import, you know, with happiness than at least I can remember. This one just came in separate from technology. Is there any research that links the rise of the celebrity influencer culture to levels of unhappiness amongst our younger high school, college folks?
Yeah, this is a spot that gets to different kind of, bad feature of our minds. We talked about hedonic adaptation and why it messes us up. Another, if I had to put like the big two of what messes us up, it'd be hedonic adaptation and this, which is that we don't experience life objectively. We think relative to stuff, relative to reference points. This is social comparison, right? What's a good salary? You can't even tell me objectively. It's like, better than my neighbor makes. What does it mean to like be pretty? Like, it's as pretty as like the prettiest influencer. And that's just a general feature of the human mind. It's actually probably a feature not just of the human mind. There's evidence for things like social comparison in monkeys and birds and things like that. It's just a basic way we're built. But the more we give ourselves social comparisons that make us feel like crap, the more like crap we're going to feel. And, there's evidence, if you look at these studies from the 80s that seem kind of, outdated now, they look at, how you feel about your own beauty, wealth level, and whatever after looking at a magazine, after looking at a fashion magazine. And, it's like in the journal, no duh, but it's like, you feel worse after looking at these models, right? Now we barrage ourselves with this information. It's not just fashion magazines that curate beautiful, wealthy looking, happy looking people. It's ourselves. Like, it's our best friends are curating, like my aunt is curating her vacation on Facebook way to make me feel bad about myself. And so, it's the influence, I have the one aunt in particular.
I got that.
But the point is that these kinds of images are around us a lot. And in some ways, a lot of us are participating in that culture, like a little bit on social media, but kind of just in general. And so, I think with social comparison, this sort of influencer culture is messing us up. It also just means that our standards feel higher. I'm doing one of our upcoming episodes is my attempt to kind of be a beginner at something, to be bad at something, right? And I think that's something, we're not so good at. Many of us were like baking bread during the pandemic, and I did this like sourdough thing, and I was like kind of proud of my sourdough. But then I went on Twitter and saw my grad students like epic like Brooklyn bakery sourdough, and I was just like, all right, I'm not, now I feel like a loser. Like, I liked my sourdough before, but now it feels pathetic. And so I think we're constantly bombarded with expertise, the best of the best, right? In a way that if you think about our hunter-gatherer days in the 50s, when our grandparents were baking bread, like, we just didn't have that in the same way. And so I do think it's affecting us. The key to remember, though, is that like we control those reference points, right? Like, you can, if Instagram is making you feel bad, you can shut it off.
I was actually amazed by that when you talk about relativity, that the story of the happiness level in the Olympics of the silver medalist versus the bronze medalist, I did not expect. But
this is something for all everybody watching to pay attention to when we all start watching the Olympians, right? Is that silver medalists, it turns out, even though they've just shown that they're the second best in the world, they're taking home this amazing medal, they're miserable. They're very saliently looking at one reference point who's better than them, which is the person that won gold. And so you can watch when everybody's on the platform, you can do your own little science experiment of like, what's the emotional expression of the silver? Are they slightly less happy than the gold, or are they experiencing things you might call disgust, contempt, deep sadness, mourning? You'll probably see it up there. And that's a case where it's like, dude, you're literally better than billions of other people, like everybody else on the planet except one. You still can't feel it.
Right. And the bronze medalist is just happy to be on the podium. So he's just happy.
And that's the explanation, right? That's the thing I think we need to pay attention to is that, I joke about, you want to find the bronze lining. The bronze guy is not comparing himself against gold, right? Like, he is, far from that, but he's thinking, oh my God, 2 seconds different, 1 point different, I wouldn't even be up here. And that's a key for all of us. We cannot be objective in our thinking, but we can kind of pick and choose our reference points, so the next time you get swept up, I'm looking, at my aunt's Facebook, and I'm like, I'm never going to go on a Spain holiday like that. It's like, wait, that's not the right reference point. Let me like open up the news section and look at, where there's flooding, where there's bad things, where there's whatever. And that automatically resets. Like, I don't have to pick a reference point that makes me feel bad. I can pick one that makes me feel that's more accurate, that makes me grateful for what I have. And often that gratitude can cause me to be like, I feel bad that I have this much, or I really want to give back because I've experienced so much gratitude. I'd like to do something for the people that are less fortunate than me. And then that's a win-win for everybody's happiness.
I think we have time for one last question. This is a good one. How do you think about the trade-off between short-term happiness and long-term happiness? The feeling of having accomplished something difficult can generate lasting happiness, but I need to sacrifice something in the short term to get there. How do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah, I think, when it's a real trade-off, right? When the long-term thing you're going for is in fact going to actually increase your happiness, I think it's tough. Most of the time, though, when we're thinking about that trade-off, we're doing it wrong, right? The long-term thing we're going for might not be the thing that's going to increase our happiness. Let me just give you a concrete example from my students. I see many of my students not sleeping, not engaging in social connection,
Right.
not like really ruining their mental health, putting themselves in that category of suicidality to go after grades, to get a particular salary, to get
Right.
accolade, whatever, right? If they eased back on that, they'd probably still make a Yale graduate salary. Maybe they'd get the B plus
Right.
instead of the A plus,
Right.
and they'd be fine, right? That I take is an error of that trade-off. They're going for something in the long term that they don't really need to maximize in the right way for our happiness. And I think sometimes when we're doing that, we're chasing this shiny carrot that we think is the key to what's going to make us happier later, but it's kind of not. And it's often at the opportunity cost of things that really will. Those social connections they're making with their friends, I feel like even for like their salary and their, job prospects and whatever, that might even be better than,
Right.
getting the extra 2 points on that problem set or something.
Right.
So I think, those trade-offs are hard, but
Yeah.
sometimes when you analyze them, you're like, wait, who's win? Like future me is winning? Like, no,
Right.
they're not. Like, whose happiness am I trying to maximize here?
Yeah. So I guess we got to get it right. Dr. Laurie Santos, thank you so much for being with us this evening. This is a personal treat, but I know something that everybody's really been looking forward to, and I'm hopeful that we can take some of these teachings with us and all be a little bit more present, in our daily lives. So thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much for having me.